Welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van Overeten, een podcast voor nieuwsgierige eters en drinkers. Elke aflevering ga ik op zoek naar culinaire kennis, leuke verhalen, gastronomische avonturen en hoop ik om zo meer te weten over eten. Ik ben Stijn de Schacht. Welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van Overeten. Het is vandaag supermooi weer. Ik zit in de Bistronomy in Vilvoorde samen met Filipe Pinto Da Silva. Filipe is een Portugees en hij gaat ons vandaag van alles en nog wat vertellen over Porto. Want Filipe werkt voor de Symington Family, een family in Portugal die heel veel verschillende Porto-merken en andere wijnen maakt. But first of all, Filipe, you have a special relationship with Belgium.
Yes, I do. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you, Stan. So yes, I was born in Porto, but actually I moved to Belgium when I was 5 years old and lived all my childhood in Belgium till I was 18, so near Brussels. I learned more French than Flemish, unfortunately. I do begreep een klein beetje, maar niet te veel. So I'll stop talking in Dutch because I will embarrass myself. But yeah, it's a great day today here. It looks like a Portuguese summer day, actually. And I come to Belgium many times now, working for the Symington family in the port business. So Belgium is one of the markets, so it's always a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
So you lived in Belgium, then you moved back to Portugal.
Yes.
How did you end up working in the port wine industry?
Well, actually, so I moved back to Porto when I turned 18, so I did my back here in Belgium. So I went to Porto for the university. Then actually I came back to Belgium. I worked a couple of years in Leuven in a cultural institute. Then I moved back to Porto. I did many things, translation. My background is actually literature, nothing to do with wine. And then in 2013, I had the opportunity to start at the Graham Sport Lodge as a guided tour. And so I speak many languages. So there was the introduction in port wine, let's say more professionally. So we had a great training, so I moved up the hierarchy in the wine tourism department of the company. And last year, they offered me the opportunity to move to the sales department. And funny enough, it was very nice to hear that Belgium was one of the markets I could visit. So I'm back many times during the year to Belgium. And yes, so the introduction was, of course, port is a Portuguese wine where it's present in Portuguese families since a long time. But professionally, 2013, that's where I entered the company and start promoting the wines of the Symingtons. And it's a beautiful drink, a drink with a big story behind that we can talk a little bit about during this interview, of course, if you want to hear about Ford.
I guess that's the reason why we're talking. But I remember the first time we went on a trip together. This was professionally. I work for the importer of Graham's. You were very desperate to get some French fries. Is there anything that you miss most about not being in Belgium?
Well, that was one of the things. Of course, we have fries in Portugal, but things taste better when they are from the place. I mean, so I remember my childhood in Belgium was great. So I did all the classic things, even though I was more not really. I was not a local person, but I always felt at home in Belgium. Yeah, the French fries, the moule and frites, then the amazing beers that you have here. Also like chocolate. I'm not a big fanatic of chocolate like some people, but of course having a nice Belgian chocolate is also nice. I mean, food is great. And yes, I mean, the Porto and Brussels are quite different cities, of course. But I love them both. And yes, when I came back, I remember when I met you for the first time, we did a sales drive promoting the wines. And I remember, we have a lunch break. Let's have some French fries with mayonnaise. I'm a classic guy. You see, I don't go for the other strange sauces that you guys have over here. But yeah, French fries, mayonnaise, moule frites is something that I always go back to when I come here. Yeah.
All right, that's awesome. Let's start talking a little bit about port wine. You keep mentioning port wine, so I will assume that it's made from grapes.
Yeah, so that's the big thing. If we think about it, if we think about wine in general, so people, even if they are not wine drinkers or even people who don't know anything about wine, they've heard about ports. I mean, we have some grandmother or an old uncle that has some bottles of port around. And so actually Belgium is quite a big port wine market. It's one of the top 3 in the world. So you guys drink a lot of port over here. Of course, it's more the entry levels. The thing about port is that it's a wine. So people tend to approach it more like a liqueur. They drink it too hot in small glasses, the entry levels. But port has many styles, has a lot of different profiles in tasting. So you have white ports, you have ruby ports, which are fruity. You have the tawny ports, much more like say licorice. So you have a port for almost every moment of the meal, before, during, after. So we just have to let people know, people taste. Things are changing. The big, the cheap ports entry level that you still see in the supermarkets, so the lowest price, the sales are going down. But the premium ports, so older ports like 10-year-old tawnies, 20 years old, vintage port, which is really something, a category that's very special. Wine in general, people are getting more and more interested, so they learn more, so they try better wines as well. Maybe we'll drink less wine in general, even beverage in general, but we'll drink better. And so we are ready to spend a little bit more money in something that's really unique and special than just the cheap wine or drink or spirit, whatever, to drink every day, I would say. So I think it's in general, even with food. So I know this podcast is mainly about food as well. So I mean, we tend to be much more careful about the food we choose to eat, where it comes from, how is it produced. So port is the same. The thing about port is that big history behind. So it's a very old wine, Portuguese wine, made in the Douros, which is in the northeast of Portugal. So only in Portugal you can make port, with the British influence behind it. So very quickly, I don't want to be too boring, but before,
no problems there. This is the whole purpose of this podcast.
Okay.
Let's go back to the beginning of the wine. So it starts with grapes, obviously in the Douro.
Exactly.
The Douro is a wine region in the northeast of Portugal.
Exactly.
Can you tell me more about the Douro region?
Yeah, so it's the name Douro is actually the name of the river that starts in Spain and finishes in Porto city in the sea, the Douro wine region. So it's a part, let's say, up the river from Porto that starts more or less 100 kilometers and then goes up to the border with Spain. So it's a Portuguese wine region. It's a very old wine region. Even before it was an official wine region, since the Romans period, there have been grapes there and people making wine. And around the 17th century, so the British start buying wine in that region, exporting to England. And in 1756, the region was established, so a denomination of origin control to make wine. So not only port, but also dry wine. And so it's a very old region. It's an amazing region. It's considered one of the most beautiful wine regions in the world. It's a mountain viticulture region, so it's really a valley. So you have an impressive mountains on both sides of the river. So it's a lot of handwork to make wine over there. So actually we have an expression in Portuguese. We say, God created the world, but man created the Douro. There was nothing there, just mountains. So we had to break rocks. The soil is schist soil, so laystein. I think I'm pronouncing correctly, more or less. So
Absolutely.
that's slate soil. And so we had to break those big rocks, build terraces, and start planting vines because it's very, very inclinated. So you have to make soil to have room to grow something. And so that was done centuries ago. And so it's the climate there, because we are away from the ocean and there's a protection of the mountains. It's very dry. So Porto, the city, is Atlantic, so it's never too hot, never too cold in the Porto city. But in the Douro region, where we make the wine, it's super dry, so it almost doesn't rain all through the year, so very, very low rainfall. And it can be very hot. So the winters actually are cold, but dry, 0 degrees, -2. But then we have 40, 45 degrees in August sometimes in the Douro. So, which is an amazing climate to produce wine, because we want the vines to suffer. When the vine suffers, gives concentrates all its survival skills in the grapes, so in the fruit. So we'll have very concentrated grapes with a lot of power. So usually, of course, port is a powerful wine in general, but even the wines of the Douro, the dry wines, are usually quite intense, fruity, full body. I'm talking about the reds. We also make the whites, of course. And so it's quite a special wine region in that. And another particularity is that in the Douro, to make port or the dry wines, we only use the native grape varieties. So they will have strange...
Is that something that you use for all wines, or just the port wines?
Port and the dry wines, what we call the DOC Douro, so the DOC Douro. we only can use the native grape varieties. We have a lot. Portugal is one of the countries with more grape varieties, native ones in the world. So in the Douro, we have more than 100 grape varieties that we can use to make port or the dry wines. So I don't know all of them by heart, but they have strange Portuguese names. So there's, in the red grapes, you have a few famous ones that if you know a little bit about wine, you've heard it for sure. Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca, Tinta Barroca, Tinta Roriz. Tinta Roriz is actually the Tempranillo on the Spanish side. So when I say native, they are Iberic grapes mainly, but most of them still exist in the Douro for centuries and centuries. So we will not use is the other famous grape varieties that people know from other places, like Merlot or Cabernet. So we don't use those in the Douro, which actually makes sense. So we use what we have there longer, best adapted, and give the best wine we can produce over there. And port, we'll always blend the grape varieties. It's a typical thing about port wine. The dry wines, we might make 100% Touriga Nacional, for example. But blending things is also what's special about port and the Douro wines. So that's, I mentioned a little bit the terroir and the climate and the grape varieties. The big difference between port wine and a dry wine starts mainly at the vinification process. So very quickly, a dry wine, so a red wine that we might drink from any region, usually, so pick up the grapes, crush the grapes, and then fermentation starts, so the sugar becomes alcohol. And that process usually takes several weeks. So at the end, all the sugar is gone, and you have a red wine with 10, 11, 12% of alcohol. Port, probably the majority already tasted some port, is a sweet wine. Why? Because we will stop the fermentation after 2-3 days. So at the second, third day, it's still almost like a grape juice, so you still have a lot of sweetness from the grapes. And at that point, you only have 5 or 6% of alcohol. But to stop the fermentation, we will fortify the wine. It means we, the industry, so that's a rule, we inject an alcohol. So the alcohol is also easy to explain. It's a brandy of wine, so it comes from wine, so it's a wine distillation. So it's not tequila or vodka or another spirit. So it's a spirit made of wine, but super neutral and 77% of alcohol. So that strong alcohol will enter the young wine, stops the fermentation by killing the yeasts, keeps the level of sugar that you want, but at the end you'll have a sweet wine naturally, but with 20% of alcohol, which is the rule to port. Port always has between 19 and 21, so 20% of alcohol. That's why people usually know port. Okay, it's sweet and a little bit stronger, so okay, it's an aperitif wine or a dessert wine, which many ports will be an aperitif or a dessert wine. But then you have many different styles, because I'm just telling the beginning of the production. You have some ports that you can drink by themselves, end of the meal, big cigar kind of thing. Well, cigar is optional, or even with some meals. So tonight we are at the Bistronomy with a wine dinner. All the dinner will be with port, from the starter to the dessert. So it's possible to enjoy port in different moments. And yeah.
You just mentioned that you start the production process. Most of the port I know is red. You also have white port.
Yes.
What's the difference between those two in terms of grapes used and production?
So obviously the big difference is that for white port, so same region, exactly the same region, but we will use the native white grape varieties of the Douro. So they also have strange Portuguese names like Rabigato, Malvasia, Muscatel, which is a bit more international, I would say, but it's been in the Douro for centuries. So we pick the white grapes, we also crush it, and we also stop the fermentation between the second, third day for the sweet white ports. Like usually white ports are more rare, so it's more a red grape variety region, the Douro. You'll have some white ports. Usually you have what we call the Lagrima white, which is a very, very sweet white port. So you really stop early the fermentation. Then you have the normal white ports that are sweet, half dry, and you have extra dry white ports that you let the fermentation go a little bit further. So you'll have a little bit less sweet. There'll always be a little bit of sweetness, of course. And those white ports, then we don't even age it in barrels. So we'll keep it in steel tanks to maintain the fresh aromas and see. And they are, for example, perfect for aperitifs, so you serve them quite cool. And something that has been very, very popular in Portugal in the last 10 years and now in other places is they are perfect, those white ports, for mixing. For example, you have a port and tonic cocktail. So instead of a gin tonic, you use the white port, tonic water, lemon, mint, ice in a glass, and it's a superb summer cocktail much lighter than a gin tonic, because gin, well, there's 40% of alcohol. So in a port and tonic, there's only 20 in the port. So you can drink a few port tonics and still be able to talk to people and not make.
It's nice and warm today,
exam.
so I
Yeah.
actually wouldn't mind having
That
one.
would be perfect for now. So
It would be a great interview with
Port.
a port tonic.
I think people have to, if they are interested, if we create an interest. I mean, don't be scared, because you've heard about port. You can start even with the old bottles that your old grandmother has. You go and see. Try to read the label. So if it's white, why not? Put it in the fridge, make the cocktail, have it a go. So that's the whites. Then the more traditional port usually come from red grapes, and that we can talk a little bit as well. So if you want, you still have questions about the white, because the white is quite interesting, could be an excellent introduction for a port consumer.
So the white, you put it in barrels and then it gets bottled, and that's
the
it.
white is still tanks, it's bottled, and then it's ready to drink. You don't need to decant, like the majority of the ports.
Okay. And then the red grapes, you add the brandy to it. Then what happens?
So when we add the brandy, fermentation is stopped. We keep so we'll have a very young red wine with sweet and 20% of alcohol. And everything we've said so far happens in the region, in the wine, in the Douro. Of course, the harvest, the vines are there, we pick up, we have the wineries there, we add the brandy there. And the red port stays in the Douro one winter, so after the harvest, which is usually September, October. And at the next spring after the harvest, we bring the wine to Gaia, Vila Nova de Gaia, which is the city next to Porto, where all the lodges of the port brands are. That's where we're going to start aging the red ports.
I think when Filipe says next to, he means on the other side of the river.
Yeah, it's
because
just across a bridge.
Exactly.
We have 6 bridges in Porto. So.
And when you are in Porto downtown, you have a great view over all the lodges.
It's I'm from Porto, I'm biased, but I think if you have a long weekend free, 3-4 days, Porto is a destination that you will fall in love with, because it's a really nice city. There's a lot of things to see. Food is great. Actually, quite cheap for, let's say, a European from Belgium or Holland or France. I mean, it's cheaper than here, I would say. The good things about life. And you could have really a nice moment. So all the lodges are actually on the other side of the river, Vila Nova de Gaia, which is a different city. And that's where we start aging the red ports. So the red port, we put it in the big vats. When I say big, you have to imagine like 80,000, 90,000 liters of wine. They look like spaceships, those big vats, barrels, so really, really high. And so all red port starts there. And everything that stays in those big vats between 2 years and 6 years and are bottled, they will be the rubies family ports. So they will always, there's different kinds of rubies, but if you see ruby on the label, so that's a wine that aged in those big vats. If you see reserve, it's a ruby port, but better quality, the choice of grapes, and a bit longer in those big vats. And so they will be young, fruity, so they can be very interesting for chocolate desserts, dark chocolate desserts, or blue cheeses, strong cheeses. They can be very interesting. What we don't bottle from between 2 and 6 years, then we pass it to smaller barrels of just 600 liters. So you imagine from 90,000 liters, you put then the wine in a much smaller recipient. So you'll have much more contact with wood. So that what was a ruby port becomes what we call a tawny port. So the color of tawnies, so you lose the red, purple, dark color. Tawnies are much more golden, amber color. So actually the flavors of the red fruits and black fruits start to disappear. In the tawny ports, you get much more the dried fruits. So first the raisins, the honey, a little bit of the dried apricots, then older tawnies, because there's no maximum. You have tawnies with 5 years, reserves with 7, then 10, 20, 30, 40, and very, very old tawnies that you can have. They become spectacular wines. But you have to imagine, keeping barrels and wine for 20, 30, 40 years is quite a thing. So, but they are spectacular wines. But much more for the young tawnies with 10, 20 years. Well, they're not that young, but they're still not as old as the others. Can be very good with pastry desserts, crème brûlée, apple pie, cinnamon desserts can be nice.
Pastéis de nata.
Pastéis de nata, typical Portuguese cake that probably people who visit Portugal know about it already.
Super delicious, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's very, very nice. With a 10-year-old, a little bit chilled is perfect. A 10-year-old tawny port is very, very good.
You just
yeah.
say chilled now, and you've
Yeah.
mentioned the white ones in the fridge.
Yeah, we're gonna talk.
Does
about
that mean?
that's very important? I
Okay.
mean, for example, a bad beverage or wine will never become good because of the temperature or the glass you serve. That's for sure. But a good wine or a good beverage, if it's not served in the right temperature, in the right glass, the experience can be ruined. So if you're paying a little bit more for a wine, you should serve it in the best way, I would say. So for the ruby ports, it's a little like red wine. So 16, 17 degrees maximum. So usually our houses are hotter than that. So you can put it a little bit in the fridge, even the ruby port. The white, you keep it in the fridge all the time because you have to serve it sealed. So the rubies, 10, 15 minutes, or just keep it in the fridge and take it out a little bit before. And you should serve port in a wine glass. Of course, there are some port glasses, but they are not those very, very small. So it's just a wine glass a little bit smaller. If you serve it in a too small glass, completely filled to the top, you cannot smell it, you cannot see the color, you cannot see. So it's not the wrong way to drink a good port. So if you don't have a port glass, you just use a white wine glass, so not too big, and you serve your ruby ports or tawny ports. So rubies, 16, 17. Tawny ports, so those who age in the small barrels and become much more delicate and much more complex, we recommend even a little bit cooler. So 12, 13 degrees would be ideal because you will not feel as much the alcohol in the beginning. The wine tends to get hotter as we serve it because our rooms, again, are 23, 24 degrees. So even if it's a little bit too cold for your taste, you just wait a little bit. If you serve it too hot, then it's too late. So you can make the experience. If you have a 10-year-old tawny port or a 20-year-old tawny port, you serve a normal temperature one, and next to it is slightly chilled. I'm almost sure 99% of the people will go for the chilled one because you feel much more the other aromas than you have the alcohol and the sweetness, which is also important, of course, in port. Yeah.
Okay, and so the 10-year-old tawnies, that to get back to that, the 20-year-olds, is that exactly 20-year-old? Is that exactly, or is that a blend of several ages?
so-
For example, in whiskey, if
Yeah.
you have a 12-year-old, that means the youngest one is a 12-year-old.
Is 12. So in port is different. So when you see 10, 20, 30, or 40, which are the classic blends for port, so it means it's an average. It means not a mathematical average. So to make a 10-year-old tawny port, we just don't join a 5-year-old and a 15, 50, 50. There you go, you have the 10. That would be super easy. I could do it. A mathematician could do it. So we have 10 in mathematics. But if you do that every year, the taste will never be the same because, as you understand, harvests are different. So when it says 10, it means we have blended wines around 10 years old. So a little bit older, a little bit younger. But every time, the result must be the same. So as a consumer, you can buy the 10 years old today or tomorrow or next year or in 5 years. You'll have the same taste, but the wines inside will be different. But the result must be very close. So 10 or 20 or 30 or 40. So it's the art of blending. And actually, the Graham's brand, which is one of the brands of the Symington family, our winemaker and master blender is one member of the family. It's Charles Symington, the one who makes the blends and the wines and the final decision. So it's an art that you learn by experience, and of course you need talent, and you have to work hard to be in that position. But it's something very special to have that blend. It's a little bit like the champagne, the cuvée, so you always have that profile, or a little bit like the whiskeys. If you always go for the same whiskey of the same brand, the same age, is that because it's not exactly always the same age. It's just the blend, the style that is repeated. So that's the thing about tawny ports, 10, 20, 30, and 40. Yeah.
And then there's also ports where there is a year mentioned on it. You have that in vintage ports. You also have that in tawny ports or colheitas. What's that exactly? Let's start with the colheitas, maybe.
Yeah. I know that's the tricky part about port is to identify the styles for the consumer. I know it's a little bit tricky, but you have if you're talking about red ports, so either it's from the ruby family or the tawny family. Both of them can be, if the year is not mentioned, it's because a blend of different years. If the year is mentioned, like an harvest, is 100% of that year. So let's start with the tawny colheita. So you have in the tawny department, so the ones who age in barrel, the blends, 10, 20, 30, and 40. But sometimes you can see single harvest tawny port from 1994 or colheita 19. Colheita is just a Portuguese mention for single harvest tawny. Okay. When you buy a tawny from a single year, so a colheita or a single harvest, you have the harvest mentioned, but you need to know when that wine was bottled. It's also always on the label, either on the back or actually in front, also next to the harvest year, because tawnies only age in the barrel. So I can be very happy and see, there's a tawny from 1980. That was the year I was born. And I'm super happy. It's the year I was born. But then I look on the back label and it was bottled in 87. So it's just a 7-year-old tawny port. It spent just 7 years in the barrel. So the real age of a colheita is the time it spends from the harvest to the bottling. So, for example, for grams, we only produce quite older colheitas. Right now, we released last year, and it's now available in Belgium as well, a 1994 single harvest tawny bottled last year. So it's 24 years in the barrel. And we released also a 1963 bottle last year. So that's 55 years in the barrel. So imagine the flavors you get from 55 years. And we have a plan to, before the end of the year, to bottle a 1940 single harvest tawny. So 79 years in the cask. So those flavors, so of course, those would be amazing. But if you buy a colheita that just spent 10 years in the cask, you better buy, well, it can be good, of course, but it's just a 10-year-old tawny port. It's better to buy the blend 20 or 30. They will be more complex. Better, at least. They will be more complex. So that's the tawny department. They only age in the barrel. So you don't need to decant those wines. You serve them slightly chilled. You can open, close the bottle, and you have a few months to drink those wines, no problem.
Because they have a stop like many spirits do, where you literally
have
can
cork,
open.
but also a wooden top, so you can open, close. That's the sign that you don't have to drink the bottle right away.
So in that sense, you don't need to treat it like a good wine.
Yeah, you need just to be like any beverage. You don't need to light on the bottle. You don't need to decant. Of course, you're not going to put it in the sunlight, but you don't do that with water as well. So I keep my tawny ports, and in Portugal we do so, and more and more people do, in the fridge. I mean, the fridge is 9-10 degrees. If it's too cold, it's a little bit cold to serve it right away, but I just take it out a little bit before, put it in the glass, and then start drinking. It's going to be 12 degrees like you should drink your tawny port, for example. But let's not overcomplicate. Slightly chilled is slightly chilled. You don't have to have a thermometer to see the temperature right away. So it's a simple drink that we drink in Portugal, especially in the family meals and friends, more traditional. But more and more, we can have a glass of port every day after work is a great moment to have as well. When you get home, before you attend to the other duties, talk to the kids if you have them, or just check the emails for tomorrow. No, you just have a glass of port. That can be a very nice habit to have, and so it will relax you a little bit. So those are the tawny ports. Then you mentioned vintage port. So vintage, go ahead.
Not just vintage, but you also have a thing called late bottled vintage. What that also usually has a year mentioned on it.
So if we go for the two styles I mentioned, a red port is either from the ruby family or a tawny family. The tawnies are easier to identify. Tawny word is always there. You'll see tawny entry level, or reserve tawny is minimum 7 years. And then you have the blends, 10, 20, 30, 40. And you might have a single harvest tawny, depending how long it spends in the cask. In the ruby family of ports, so the young fruity style, that can be a little bit more tricky, because the only one who says ruby is the entry level. If you see ruby is the cheapest one, it's 2-3 years in those big vats, and it's it's a nice port to drink, but it will not be the most complex. So above the ruby, you have then what we can call a late bottle vintage. So you'll have, for example, late bottle vintage 2012. So a late bottle vintage is actually a wine that spends 5 years in those big vats. So, and it's filtered, doesn't age in the bottle, the majority of them. So you drink it, you buy it to drink. So you have the ruby entry level. LBV, late bottle vintage, would be a ruby of a single year, but better quality. They are the introduction in good fruity ports. And then you have the king of port, which is just vintage port.
Are LBVs made every year?
You can usually make, so you just need to keep the wine 5 or 6 years in those big vats and then release it. So if people go to a wine shop today to look for a late bottle vintage, they will probably find the 2011, maybe the 12, maybe already a 13, because we're already in 2019. But so you don't keep your LBVs, your late bottle vintage, in the cellar to age, unless it says unfiltered, but let's not complicate things. So LBVs are filtered, they don't age in the bottle. They're just a 5-6-year-old ruby port. Very good quality, very good money for value. That can be interesting. So late vintage means harvest.
late bottled. Why? Because it's 5 years after the harvest or 6 that you bottle those wines. So it's actually simpler than you might think. I
So
hope I'm
this is
explaining
right
it well.
before you would put it in the barrels to become a tawny.
Exactly. So between 2 and 6 years in those big vats, we'll start to decide what is going to be for the fine ruby, the ruby entry level, what we keep individually for 5 years for the LBVs. The rest, then we start to transit to the smaller casks, then to include in the tawny ports, and so in the entry level, reserve 10, 20, 30, or even keep a colheita longer. So those are the two families. Then vintage. So when you see, for example, Graham's vintage port 1980, for example, vintage port, it's a port wine, so it's like the tawnies or the ruby style, so it's actually from the ruby family, so it's a port wine. We produce it the same way, but we only make a vintage port the best year. So that one, we don't produce it every year. So we need a very good harvest, so the quality of the grapes must be very, very good. So if the year is not good enough, all the production of port will go for the big vats and the barrels for the tawnies and the rubies. If the year is exceptional, with the best wines of that year, we bottle them very young, unfiltered, and they will age in the bottle. So if you see a vintage 1980, it was bottled 2 winters after the harvest, so super young, but it's not filtered, so it will age in the bottle like a red wine of high quality. So of course it's different to drink a young vintage or an older one. So more time it spends in the bottle, the wine will evolve. So evolution inside the bottle is different from evolution inside the barrel. That's why a tawny is so different from a vintage port. You can have a tawny colheita, so single harvest, 94, bottle last year. But we also have the vintage 94. If we open them today, both today, so one spent 24 years in the barrel, the other one 24 years in the bottle, they are exactly the same wine in the beginning, but today they are totally different. So the evolution of the wine is completely different in the barrel or in the bottle. Vintage, to have an idea, we produce 3 times every decade a vintage port. It's very rare. So the classic years, or the best of the best, they are very, very special wines. They are really the reflection of the Douro Valley as a terroir thing. So you feel the Douro Valley when you taste those wines. As opposite to the tawnies are more the lodge, so where we age, where we have the barrels, the coopers, the master blenders. So they are the 2 families of the great ports, either an old tawny or a vintage port. But vintage, okay, you need to be a little bit more, so you can drink young. It will be super fruity, red fruits, plums, really intense, acidity very high. But if you keep it in your cellar 10, 20, 30 years, or if you buy an older one and you open today, it will be much more complex, soft. We usually joke a little bit. So if you open a young vintage port, like a 2007 or a 2011, you should invite a lot of friends, because you drink a little bit and it will be like a bomb of flavors. So a little bit is enough for you to be satisfied. But if you open a 1963 or 1955, even a 1994 or a 1980, you only invite the good friends, because there you can drink several glasses, much more, and they are spectacular wines. You just need, so they will have a cork like a normal red wine, so you need to take the cork out. You should decant it because there will be sediments, especially if it's an older vintage, and you enjoy it. It's a slow drink that you have with very nice cheeses or nice desserts, and you drink it through an evening, and you can trust me, when you open a vintage bottle, the wine inside disappears quite fast. I mean, it's not a problem usually. Yeah. At least in my place.
That's from experience that you're talking there.
as well. Yeah.
These sort of vintages, they're always from one year. Does that mean they're from one vineyard, or is that a blend, or
So
how does that work?
Depends of the brand. For example, Graham's, that is our one of the most prestigious port houses that we have. When you see Graham's Vintage Port 2011, for Graham's we have 5 vineyards in the Douro actually. So that year, for example, 2011, was so good in all the region that we went to the 5 vineyards that we own to make the Graham's ports, and we collect, and so we produce wines in the 5 vineyards, and we took the 5 best of the 5 and we blended, and so you have what we call a classic vintage year. Imagine that the year is not good everywhere in the region, but just good in one of the vineyards, for example. And for Graham's, the main vineyard has a Portuguese name. It's called Quinta. Quinta means estate, domain, dos Malvedos. So if you see a Graham's Quinta dos Malvedos vintage 2005, for example, it means 2005 was not good everywhere in the region, but very good in that Quinta. So we made a vintage with only grapes from that Quinta. So all ports are a blend of grape varieties. Some ports are a blend of different vineyards, like the Graham's Classic Vintage or the Tawny ports. Some ports are from a specific vineyard, but they all are blends of different grape varieties. So that's part of the deal. Yeah.
And so these vintages are always from 1 year.
Yes.
Does it not happen that wines from several years are blended and treated like a vintage?
No, so when we blend different years, that's in the tawny family to make the 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Every time you see the year mentioned on the bottle of port, it will be 100% from that year.
Okay.
That's,
But so then what is a crusted port?
yeah,
Because that's another category
yeah,
that exists.
You're asking very specific and specialized questions about port. So
that's why we're having you here.
That's
I mean,
that's superb
you're
for me.
you're
Everyone. It's very rare that anyone asks about that category in particular. So we go back to the ruby family. That's the tricky one. The tawnies, like I said, they age in the barrel. The older they are, more complex, and the bottle also is tawny. If we go back to the ruby family, so if the bottle says ruby,
just to summarize everything, what we've had so far in the ruby family is you have the fine ruby, which is the entry level. You have the reserve ruby, which is the better quality, blend of several years.
Yeah.
Then you have the late bottled vintage, which is 5 years in the big fooders, wooden vats. And then you also have the vintage port.
Yeah. So a crusted port, which is a super rare style that you actually only find in the UK market and in Portugal, it's actually something between before you reach to the vintage category. So if you go back to that scale that you were doing, so fine ruby is the entry level, then you have reserve ports, which are actually rubies of better quality, but they don't say the year because they are a blend of different years, young wines in big vats. Late bottle vintage is 1 year, but they spent 5 in the big vats. And then on top, you have vintage port. But before vintage, we can have what we call a crusted port, which is actually easy to explain. A crusted port is a blend of young wines that age in those big vats, but wines that almost make it as vintage, and we bottle it not filtered as well. So imagine this. So the crusted will not mention the harvest because they are a blend. They will mention the bottling. So crusted port grams bottled in 2012. It means inside that bottle, you probably have wines, a little bit of 11, which was a vintage year. So the rest, what that was not bottled, was in that bottle, went for a big vat, and 07 and 09, for example. So it's young wines together that almost make it as vintage, but didn't for some reason. We kept it apart, and then we bottle as a vintage port. So a crusted might age in the bottle also 20, 30 years, and it's less expensive than a vintage. Actually, if you go, it's also in terms of price and complexity. Fine ruby, entry level, it's cheaper. Then you have reserves or LBVs that are rubies, around 15, 16 euros, perfect introduction. And then you have crusted port, which is difficult to find, especially in Belgium, but it will be around 25, 30 euros. And then you have vintage port that can be, depending on the year, more expensive. And so you have some vintages around 80, 90 euros. And if it's something from the 60s, 50s, can be hundreds of euros because of the rarity, of course. So, yeah. So a crusted is from the ruby family.
So then that's what we finish at the crusteds. Then we enter the tawnies, where you have the blends, the tawny 10, 20, 30, 40. Then you have the colliators, which are higher in quality. What's the oldest wine that you have on the market?
So for grams, we are. That's why it's like time traveling, because we are a old wine region. The brands, the port wine brands are the traditional ones like ours are quite old. So we have quite older wine. So in 2014, the family decided to put on the market, and it's still a few bottles available, of a very, very old tawny port. So to have an idea, very quickly to explain. So the Grams brand is now part of the Symington family, but the first Symington arrived in Porto in 1882. He arrived there very young to work with the Grams family, but then he married a Portuguese lady, and he became someone important, and he bought Grams a little bit later on. So in 1910, 1915, more or less, when he was already married to the Portuguese lady, someone important in the port trade, he wanted a souvenir from the year he got to Portugal, 1882. So he bought 4 casks with wine from 1882, port wine from a small producer that he knew, and he bought those casks for himself, chose to drink with the family at Christmas, at parties, etc. 130 years later, from the 4 casks that A.J. Symington, the first one, bought, this generations of Symingtons, they had 3 casks left. So one was consumed, and also the evaporation, the angel's share, so it's part of the aging the tawnies. So the 3 casks, they decided to bottle one of the casks. So we released 656 bottles of a very, very old tawny port, 1882 bottle in 2014, so 132 years old, aging in cask. So yeah, that's something quite special.
What does that taste like?
Yeah, well, I've been lucky enough to taste it almost twice. Once for sure, I had a very nice glass. The second time was just a drop. But it's difficult to explain. It's also a part of an emotion, but it's amazingly, there's still a lot of acidity, citrus, like orange zest peel on the nose. So it's quite like you're peeling an orange at the beginning when you smell it. Then you're hit with the hammer of the old flavors. So coffee, tobacco, tea leaves. So, and it's a little bit even, the texture is so dense, so it becomes like almost like syrup, so it sticks with you for a long time. So you just need a few drops almost, and you don't need a full big glass. And it's a wine that, it's a luxury product, but in the luxury wines, you have much more expensive things than that one. We're talking about thousands of euros a bottle. But I mean, port is very honest in all the prices. When you pay 5 euros for a bottle of port, the cheap ones in the supermarket, okay, you'll get a wine that's 5 euros. It's okay. It's nothing special. When you pay 14, 15, you'll get a very, very nice port. When you pay 20, 25, 40 euros for a bottle of port, you'll get an excellent port. And if you pay 100 or thousands, you'll get something that are considered the best wines in the world. Not like other regions sometimes. So that's, but that Neobli is the name of the Grams Neobli. It's a colheita from 1882, bottled in 2014. And it was, the taste, I mean, it's almost indescribable, but it was great. Probably I'll never taste it again, but unless it's professionally, but it was a great experience. It was a few years ago.
And what about the vintages? What's the oldest vintage that you've had to try?
So, vintage port, because vintage, like I told you, ages in bottle. So vintage port only start to appear when the bottle shape got the appearance we know as a bottle of wine today. That was in the late 1800s. So you have vintages in our cellar. In the oldest vintage we have is 1868, but I never tasted that one. But I've been lucky enough to taste the 1924 from Grams, and it was a super delicate. When they get that old, those vintage ports, they become very delicate. So the fruitness is still there, but they are more like the floral aromas, like rose perfumes, and you get they almost don't need a food pair because they are very delicate. But if you ask me, was it your favorite? No, it was amazing experience in 1924, but I actually like to taste also quite younger vintages. 2000, 2003 are amazing. 94s, 85s, 80. That was the year I was born. I was lucky. I was born in a vintage year. Tasted a few times. But then, 63 is an iconic year in port. 1963 vintage ports are amazing. 55 also. I mean, a vintage, because we only produce it when the year is good, you always have an excellent wine, especially if you are drinking from the best brands on the market. So vintage port is always high quality.
Okay. Just one last thing before we wrap this up. We just had a tasting yesterday of 2017 vintage. That means 2 years ago it was made into a wine and now it was bottled. What's so special about this one? Because there was also a vintage in 2016.
So we're living something special the last few years because, so like I told you, vintage, we don't produce it every year. To have an idea, so we, since the year 2000, we declared, and when I say we, the industry, so it was very excellent years and vintages were released. So the 2000, so released in 2002, so it's always after 2 years. So 2000, 2003, 2007, and 2011 were the last vintages declared a few years ago. Then last year, so actually 3 years ago, 2016, we had an amazing harvest, tasted the wines during the winter of 17 and last year, and the wines were spectacular, so we declared the 2016 vintage port. And the reception was amazing. If you read about vintage port, the 16s, and not only ours, but from the industry, but mainly ours, the Grams, the Dows, the Wars, they have amazing rates. But then we found, we already knew it, but we had like a decision to make, because after 16, 17 appeared, and we made extraordinary wines as well. And so we had this decision to make. Should we declare 2 in a row, something that never happened in the port wine trade overall? So the last back-to-back declaration is from the 30s, and not every brand, and even older than that, 130 years ago. So it's but then we tasted the wines, and it would be a crime not to declare the 17 as well. Personally, last year when I tasted the 16s, I was really impressed. But this year the 17s I was blown away. So we are now bottling the 17s. So we had an event yesterday to present some of the vintages here with cask samples. But the wines are now being bottled, the 2017 vintage, and will be very soon available, before the end of the year available in the market. But it's very small production. Vintage port is the last fine wine in the world that you can still pay a bottle for it. It's a wine that for the consumer will come out around 80, 85 euros. I know it's not cheap, but we're talking about fine wine. If you think about Chateau d'Yquem or Petrus from Bordeaux, or even some Burgundies, it's much more expensive than that, so you need to be rich to buy a bottle. Here, you just need to really love wine and make an investment of 80 euros or 90 euros if you really like a nice wine to have.
80 euros plus 20, 30 years.
For example. Yeah, the thing is, you tasted them yesterday with me. You can already enjoy them quite young. They are super young. They're like young babies. But of course, we had also next to it some older vintages that are easier to drink. With time, I mean, it takes time to things getting married. But yeah, it's a choice. Either you go look for an older vintage to drink now in the next few years, or you make the choice. You buy a young vintage today, you put it in your cellar or in a cool place, you forget about it, and you put in your iPhone calendar to drink when I don't know, get married or have the second kid or third kid. I don't know, depends on what you would like to celebrate, and you forget about that bottle. And they are amazing wines, yeah.
All right. Is there a way for people to learn more about Grahams and port wine when they come to Porto? Because you invited them over for a long weekend. Surely they must come and visit.
Of course. So we have, on the side, Gaia side, so the city next to Porto, on the other side of the river, where all the lodges are. So we have the Grams Lodge, that's where we age our ports, but we also have tours. And if you go to the Grams website, you'll see a lot of information. Now we only accept tours by reservation. It's very small groups, but it's worthwhile, the experience. So you get to Grams, you'll have a tour that usually lasts 45 minutes, 1 hour, and the cost of the tour will depend on the wines you might choose to taste. So we have menus always with 3 ports included, and we don't propose the entry level. So no fine ruby, no fine tawny to taste. It starts at reserve ports, LBVs, 10 years old tawny port, the classic tasting. But then you have the opportunity to taste also older vintages and old tawnies. And you have the opportunity to taste the very, very old one, 1882. You have to pay for it, but we have a 5 cl bottle for tasting of that very old port. It's, I think, now 500 euros the 5 cl bottle. But it's a one-time experience. I mean, there's a market for those things, and if you really are into those things, that experience is amazing. But you don't have to pay 500 euros to visit Grams. With 17 euros, you already have a tour and 3 wines to taste. We also have a restaurant that's beautiful. Now, I think people, if you are interested, check the website. The Grams website, there's a lot of information, and you can get a feeling of what we do over there.
And that is only in Porto or in Gaia that you can visit, or can you also go to the vineyards in the Douro?
So that's in Porto. Then in the Douro, as we have different brands, we have quite a lot of vineyards, but we have one that's open for visits as well in the same concept. It's Quinta do Bonfim. So it's in Pinhão. Pinhão, it's a village really in the central part of the Douro wine region. So you can even go from Porto to Pinhão in an amazing train trip. It's like 2.5 hours by train, a slow train that goes next to the river. Once you enter the wine region, it's really beautiful. So again, if you check our website of Grams, you'll have the Grams Lodge information. If you check the Symington Family Estates website, you'll have the Quinta do Bonfim information. So in the Quinta do Bonfim, you can even taste not only Grams, but our dry wines and other ports that we have. and you see an amazing place. The vineyards all around, a beautiful view, amazing tasting room. Yeah.
All right, Filipe, muito obrigado. Thank you so much for the explanation. I learned a lot again from you. I hope our listeners did too. Dankjewel aan iedereen om te luisteren. Als je het een leuke aflevering vond, laat zeker een review na. Dat helpt om andere mensen deze podcast te laten ontdekken. Deel hem ook gerust met mensen waarvan je denkt dat die interessant kan zijn. En dan horen we jou op een volgende aflevering opnieuw. Dankjewel, tot dan. Dit was Overeten, een podcast over eten. Voor meer informatie, show notes, foto's, behind the scenes en meer, bezoek ons op www.overetenpodcast.be. Dankjewel voor het luisteren en tot binnenkort.